He solved homicides, trained rookies, and wore his badge with pride until a routine drive home turned into a takedown caught on camera, mistaken for a suspect ignored when he said he was a cop. But what if that moment of injustice became the spark that shattered a system? This isn't just one man's story. It's a reckoning you won't see coming. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The streets of New Orleans don't sleep. They smolder. And on a fog-laced Thursday night, in the heart of the 7th Ward, that heat didn't come from jazz clubs or neon signs. It came from a gun drawn on the wrong man, Detective Julian Carter, a 42-year-old black homicide investigator with over 2 decades on the force, lay face down on the pavement, the cold steel of handcuffs biting into his wrists, a knee pressed into his spine. A crowd had gathered, some silent others shouting. Phones lit up the night. "He's a cop," someone screamed. But the officer holding the gun, Officer Brent Harlan, didn't flinch. His voice was flat mechanical. "Stay down. Stop resisting." There was no resisting. Only Julian motionless. Only the sound of disbelief. The truth glinting inches away in the form of his badge discarded in the gutter. This wasn't a shootout. It wasn't even a routine stop. It was a moment of recognition denied. A detective mistaken for a suspect because all Harlan saw was a hoodie and a black man behind the wheel of a dark sedan in the wrong part of town at the wrong time of night. What happened next would ignite a firestorm. But in that instant, Julian wasn't a symbol. He was a man stripped of everything he'd earned, laying beneath a badge that suddenly meant nothing. 12 hours earlier, Julian had been behind his desk at NOPD headquarters, poring over a triple homicide case that had left him sleepless for 3 nights straight. He was the kind of cop who didn't just solve murders. He carried the weight of each victim, like they were his own kin. A quiet, thoughtful presence on the force. Known for his fairness, respected for his discipline, and often overlooked by those who didn't look like him. That night, he skipped the elevator and took the stairs down to the garage keys in hand exhaustion in his bones. His shift had ended, but the adrenaline from chasing leads hadn't left him. He drove his unmarked Dodge Charger through Esplanade Avenue, the city lights slicing through fog like ghosts whispering warnings. He wore a hoodie, not standard uniform, but it was cold, and he was off duty. He passed renovated shotgun houses and corner stores clinging to their last breath of old New Orleans before gentrification drowned them out. He turned onto a dim side street just a few blocks from his home. That's when he noticed it. The patrol car trailing him, lights off, engine quiet. A hunter pacing its prey. Julian signaled, made a careful left, obeyed every rule he taught rookies a dozen times. The car followed. He pulled into a well-lit spot near a bodega, planning to grab a bottle of water before heading home to his wife Danielle. As he stepped out, the patrol car accelerated. Brakes screeched. A spotlight snapped on, drowning him in white light. He shielded his eyes. "Hands where I can see them." The voice came sharp, commanding, familiar, but not friendly. Julian raised his hand slowly. "Officer, I'm against the car." Now the officer advanced. It was Harlan. Julian knew of him, a reputation built on force, not finesse. A man who made stops that never made reports. And now that man had a gun aimed at Julian's chest. "I'm Detective Carter, homicide badges in my back pocket. You can verify right now." Harlan didn't check. He didn't ask. He grabbed Julian's arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him against the hood. Pain burst through Julian's shoulder. Somewhere behind them, a bystander shouted, "Yo, that's Julian Carter. That's a detective." A woman nearby started recording. The red light blinked. Julian stayed calm. "I am not resisting. Please check my badge. Nice trick," Harlan muttered. Should have thought this through. Another officer arrived, but instead of de-escalating, he joined in. No one checked the ID. No one paused. No one questioned. In that moment, Julian Carter was not a detective. He was a suspect, a target, a profile, not a person. The video, grainy but clear, caught it all. Julian on his knees, blood at his temple from where his head struck the car. The crowd pleading with the officers to stop his voice, low and pained, repeating, "I'm a cop. I'm on your side." By sunrise, the footage had made its way to the morning news, accompanied by a question that shook the city. If even the best among us aren't safe, who is? But this isn't just a story about a mistaken identity. It's about the fragility of respect when it collides with race, about how centuries of prejudice can overpower years of service in the blink of an eye, about a man who spent his life defending justice only to find himself begging for it on the very streets he once patrolled. Stay with us, because this is not the end of Julian Carter's story. It's the beginning of a reckoning. By the time the sun rose over New Orleans, Detective Julian Carter was no longer just a name inside the precinct. He was a headline. The footage shot by a teenage bystander on a cracked iPhone had gone viral overnight. Millions had already seen him face down in the street, blood trickling from his temple, his badge glinting like a bitter afterthought on the curb. The caption that accompanied it was simple: "Black cop mistaken for suspect by NOPD." And just like that, everything began to unravel. Inside the NOPD headquarters, the atmosphere was strange, somewhere between disbelief and dread. No one looked Julian in the eye as he walked through the corridors the next morning. Conversations dropped when he passed, not out of respect, but out of fear. Fear that his humiliation might be contagious, that standing too close meant choosing a side. Some officers nodded awkwardly, unsure of what to say. Others simply turned away. Julian didn't need apologies. He needed accountability. But that was a currency rarely spent in buildings like this. Captain Eliza Monroe called him into her office before noon. Her voice was clipped formal, but her eyes flickered with something deeper. Guilt, maybe, or the quiet calculation of someone already watching their career tremble beneath public scrutiny. "We're initiating an internal inquiry," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Julian didn't sit. He stood stiff arms, folded, his voice flat. "An inquiry into what exactly? Me or the officer who slammed my head against a hood and cuffed me for trying to go home?" Monroe hesitated. Protocol was breached. "Officer Harlan has been placed on administrative leave. Paid, I assume?" "Yes." "Pending investigation?" Julian laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course, he didn't ask for sympathy. What he wanted was something harder to give truth. Transparency. But the system wasn't built for that, not when its shields were woven from silence. Outside the department walls, the story had already ignited a national firestorm. Civil rights advocates, black law enforcement associations, and even former NOPD officers went public with support. Some called it negligence. Others called it racial profiling. Everyone called it unacceptable. And Julian, he became the face of a story he never asked to star in. Danielle, his wife, tried to convince him to take a few days off, but he couldn't. Not when the whispers inside the precinct began turning into questions. Some officers speculated that maybe he had matched a suspect description. Maybe it wasn't Harlan's fault. Maybe the whole thing was blown out of proportion. Maybe Julian had overreacted. That's how systems deflect blame, by rewriting the story. The department's press release came 2 days later. Carefully worded, sanitized. It acknowledged the incident, stated that due process was being followed, and offered vague assurances that the NOPD values all its officers equally. Nowhere did it mention racial bias. Nowhere did it mention Julian by name. But the public didn't buy it. Protests swelled outside City Hall. Hundreds marched through Canal Street, holding signs that read, "Badge, Protection, and we are Julian Carter." Local news ran stories about other black officers who had experienced similar treatment. Stopped on their own streets, questioned in plain clothes, doubted even when flashing credentials. Julian's case wasn't an exception. It was an example. And still inside the department, the unraveling continued. His desk was moved, quietly reassigned to a temporary rotation in administrative review. They said it was to give him space. He knew it was to minimize visibility, keep the press away, keep the discomfort contained. Worse, his cases, his real work, were stripped from him. Open homicides he'd poured himself into, now handed off to rookies or officers who didn't understand the neighborhoods like he did. It wasn't punishment, not officially, but it was isolation. Exile with a badge. Julian tried to keep his head down, to focus on the facts, on the truth, but truth had become slippery. Even his own union was slow to offer support. Leaders who once shook his hand after big arrests were suddenly quiet. Their statements hedged, cautious, afraid of alienating the rank and file, afraid of choosing the wrong side in a department split, not just by policy, but by fear. Then came the threats. At first, just anonymous emails. Then a voicemail, "Should have kept your mouth shut. Carter, now you're just another story waiting to be forgotten." He reported them. Of course he did. But the response was tepid. "We'll look into it," was all he got. No follow-up. No real protection. Just a nod to process and a quiet hope that he'd let it blow over. But Julian couldn't let it go. Not because of pride, but because the unraveling wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every officer of color who walked into that building wearing a badge and still got followed around in department stores. It was about his younger colleagues, the black recruits, who still believed the system could work if they just played by the rules. He couldn't look them in the eye if he didn't fight back. So he started documenting everything. Every conversation, every delay, every threat, every meeting where people said a lot without saying anything. He began building a case, not for court, but for the court of public opinion. Because if the system wasn't going to hold itself accountable, maybe the world would. The decision came slowly, like a weight settling on Julian Carter's chest, night after night, until breathing in silence became impossible. He had spent weeks waiting for the system to fix itself. He had given them time, offered the benefit of the doubt, followed every procedure and official channel. But nothing changed. Officer Harlan remained on administrative leave, untouched by consequences. The threats continued, and the cold stares within the precinct only grew colder. Julian realized then the system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, and if he wanted it to change, he would have to break it open. The first crack in the blue wall came quietly. A text from Officer Malik Jennings, a fellow black detective who had risen through the ranks with Julian and had once served as his partner before being reassigned to traffic enforcement after filing an internal complaint. The message was short. "Still got your back. Meet me tonight. I've got something you need to see." They met in the back of a coffee shop in the Bywater district where the jazz from the corner stereo covered their hushed voices. Malik slid a USB drive across the table. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, "but you'll want to look at the incident logs from Harlan's unit. The one's internal affairs accidentally omitted from their report." Julian's hands trembled slightly as he took the drive, but he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded, pocketed the evidence, and offered a quiet thank you. That night, in the dim light of his home office, Julian watched his screen fill with dates, reports, and names. The file contained a detailed record of Officer Harlan's stops over the last 18 months. Nearly 80% of the individuals he had detained or questioned were Black or Latino disproportionate, even by the skewed demographics of high crime patrols. Several incidents involved use of force, but none had triggered disciplinary action. Most were marked resolved or no further action recommended. Many didn't include Bodycam footage. Julian stayed up past 3 a.m., reading line after line, name after name. The system hadn't just failed, it had protected its own with precision. But he wasn't alone anymore. Word began to spread that Julian was building something. A case, a report, a reckoning. Some officers kept their distance. Others quietly stepped forward. He began receiving anonymous tips, blurred screenshots of internal emails, clipped audio of locker room conversations where fellow officers dismissed the incident as just another one of those race cards. But the most damning moment came from within internal affairs. Lieutenant Rachel Park, a Korean-American officer known for keeping her head down, approached Julian in the parking lot. "Late one night, I watched your arrest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was on duty that night. I saw the footage before it was archived. They deleted half of it before the investigation even began, but I kept a copy in case someone ever had the guts to ask." She handed him a second USB. On it, the unedited body cam footage from Harlan's unit the night Julian was stopped. The video was brutal. Harlan approaching with his weapon drawn, ignoring Julian's clear identification. Julian stating calmly, "I'm a detective with NOPD badge number 33917. Harlan cutting him off, shouting, pushing him to the ground before backup even arrived. The badge was visible. The voice was unmistakable. There was no justification, only bias in motion. This wasn't just misconduct, it was a crime. Julian didn't hesitate. He contacted Gloria Ayers, a civil rights attorney who had spent 2 decades fighting police brutality cases across the South. Within 24 hours, she assembled a legal team. "We're not suing for damages," she told Julian. "We're demanding a federal investigation." Julian was exhausted. His career was all but finished. But when he thought about walking away, he pictured the face of every young recruit who had ever asked him, "What's it like to be a black cop?" He couldn't walk away from them. He gave Gloria everything, every report, every video, every message. The press conference was scheduled within the week. Julian stood at the podium outside the NOPD headquarters, flanked by Gloria and a dozen community leaders, pastors, activists, and even a few off-duty officers who had quietly come to stand behind him. Microphones clicked on. Cameras rolled. The street buzzed with anticipation. He spoke without notes. For years, I believed that if I just did the job right, wore the badge, upheld the law, served with honor, I could be part of the change. But the truth is, no amount of badges can shield you from the biases this system refuses to confront. He paused, scanning the crowd. I was stopped, assaulted, and humiliated, not because of what I did, but because of how I look. I showed my badge. I followed protocol. I identified myself. And it didn't matter, because the officer who pulled me over didn't see a detective. He saw a threat. The silence was thick. And what's worse, Julian continued, is that the system knew, and it protected him anyway. The NOPD buried evidence, ignored warnings, and tried to disappear me into paperwork and silence. He raised the flash drive in his hand. But silence isn't safety, and I refused to stay silent anymore. Reporters erupted with questions. The story broke within minutes, unreleased. Bodycam footage contradicts. Official police account. Major networks picked it up. Hashtags trended. The DOJ announced it would review the materials Julian's legal team submitted. Back inside the precinct, the ripple turned into a wave. Some officers were furious. They saw Julian as a traitor, a man who turned against the shield. But others, officers of all backgrounds, started speaking out. Whistleblower complaints increased. One rookie cop emailed Julian, "Thank you. I didn't know if I could stay in this job. Until now." Julian knew this was only the beginning. The blue wall had begun to crack, not by force, but by truth, and behind every crack was a light waiting to pour through. The courtroom felt colder than the air outside, though New Orleans was in the middle of its early spring thaw. The marble walls of the Orleans Parish Courthouse seemed to breathe judgment, their silence, heavier than any gavel. Julian Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture calm, but his eyes sharp and relentless. This wasn't just a trial about one traffic stop or one rogue officer's abuse of power. It was about whether America was willing to confront the reality of what its badge meant when worn over black skin. Across the room, Officer Eric Harlan sat at the defense table, his uniform replaced by a crisp navy suit, his expression unreadable. His defense team, 3 high-priced attorneys flown in from Baton Rouge, had been posturing for weeks, but no amount of tailored rhetoric could erase the video that had now been played on every major network. The footage didn't lie. The badge didn't protect. The silence afterward had screamed complicity. The courtroom gallery was full. Reporters lined the back, scribbling notes or tapping feverishly on laptops. Local activists filled the benches behind Julian, their faces taut with expectation. Among them sat Julian's mother, eyes wet but proud, and his cousin Malcolm, who'd flown in from Detroit just to be present. His wife Naomi held his hand beneath the table, her grip steady, a grounding force in the sea of tension. The prosecution opened with clarity. Gloria Ayers didn't waste time with theatrics. She laid out the facts like stones. Julian Carter, a decorated detective with a spotless record, was assaulted, detained, and publicly humiliated after clearly identifying himself to another officer. That officer, Harlan, ignored protocol, ignored identification, and used force anyway. More damningly, the department failed to act. Internal affairs, buried reports, evidence was mishandled. Bodycam footage was suppressed. This case, Gloria said, her voice cool and firm, is not simply about misconduct. It is about the rot that grows when institutions choose protection over accountability. It's about a man who served his city being treated as a suspect simply because of his skin. And it's about a city that almost let it happen in silence. Julian watched the jury, 9 women, 3 men, faces of different ages, backgrounds, races. Some nodded, some looked stunned. Others already seemed hardened. He knew from years of trial prep as a detective that expressions didn't always betray beliefs. But hope stirred anyway. The defense struck back with a strategy as old as the courtroom itself: discredit and distract. They painted Harlan as a dedicated officer, making a split-second decision under stress. They questioned Julian's tone, his movements, his past. One attorney even dared to ask, "Isn't it possible that the defendant acted as any reasonable officer might not knowing your identity?" Julian felt the sting, but he didn't break. He didn't shift in his seat or cast his eyes down. He had waited too long, fought too hard to show anything but truth. When it was his turn on the stand, the courtroom hushed. He walked forward, not as a man seeking vengeance, but as a witness to a system that had nearly broken him. He spoke calmly. He didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. "I did everything I was trained to do." He said, "I announced myself. I complied. I kept my hands visible. I identified myself clearly verbally and with a badge. And none of it mattered because he didn't see a fellow officer. He saw a threat." His voice tightened slightly, but he pressed on. "I've worn this badge for over a decade. I've walked into murder scenes, comforted grieving families, de-escalated violent standoffs. I've done the job with pride. But that night, I was reminded that all of it could be erased in seconds. Not by a criminal, but by a fellow officer who couldn't imagine that a black man could hold authority." He paused. "I wasn't just cuffed that night. I was stripped of dignity, of identity, of protection. And when I spoke up, the system tried to silence me. This case isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been told their experience doesn't count, because the system says otherwise." The room was still. Even the judge seemed momentarily moved her gavel, resting quietly in her hand. In the days that followed, testimonies mounted. Gloria brought in expert witnesses, criminologists, psychologists, data analysts, each painting a clear and devastating picture. Harlan's record was part of a pattern. NOPD's failure to discipline him was not an oversight. It was a choice. And Julian's experience wasn't isolated. It was systemic. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when Lieutenant Rachel Park testified. She spoke of her own experience within internal affairs. She confirmed the suppression of footage. She detailed the culture of avoidance, the unspoken understanding that officers like Harlan were protected, while whistleblowers were punished. "I almost left the department after this," she said, her voice shaking. "But I couldn't live with myself if I let silence become policy." In response, the defense fumbled. They attempted to redirect, but the narrative had shifted. They could no longer spin Julian as emotional or irrational. The receipts were too thorough, the pattern too damning. On the final day, Gloria's closing argument tied everything together. Officer Harlan made a decision that night, one rooted not in protocol, but in prejudice. But more dangerous than his actions was the department's silence afterward. That silence speaks to every marginalized officer, every citizen who fears that compliance might not be enough to survive an encounter. We are not here to destroy the institution. We are here to rebuild it. But we cannot rebuild what we refuse to confront. The jury deliberated for 10 hours. 10 hours of uncertainty. 10 hours of memory and doubt circling through Julian's mind like ghosts. What if it wasn't enough? What if this was another story that ended in disappointment? But when the jury returned, the room stood still. Guilty on all counts. The words washed over Julian like a tide. Not triumph, not joy. Just a deep exhale. The breath he'd been holding since the moment Harlan pulled him from his car. The courtroom erupted, some in cheers, others in stunned silence. Harlan remained frozen in his seat, lips pressed into a hard line. The gavel struck, and justice, at least in this case, was served. Julian didn't smile. He didn't cry. He stood, looked at the people who had stood beside him, and walked out of the courtroom with his head high. This wasn't the end. But for the first time, the scales had tilted, even if just a little. The city never slept. Not really. Not New Orleans. Even in the early morning hours, the streets hummed with life in quiet corners. Jazz drifted faintly from some second-floor window, mingling with the scent of chicory coffee and something fried. But for Julian Carter, this morning felt different. It wasn't just the end of a legal battle. It was the beginning of something deeper, something slower, and more enduring. The work of rebuilding trust. It had been 3 weeks since the verdict. Officer Eric Harlan was in custody pending sentencing, and the department that once seemed impenetrable had finally begun to show signs of change. Not proclamations or slogans, but action. The city council had approved the formation of a new civilian oversight board. A full audit of Bodycam protocols was underway. More importantly, a growing coalition of citizens and officers led by Julian himself had started training sessions designed not to defend the department's image, but to reshape its soul. Julian stood outside the Claiborne Community Center, clipboard in hand, watching as a group of young recruits filed into the modest brick building. They looked nervous. Some barely out of their teens, others older career changers or former military. All of them carried the same mixture of caution and conviction in their eyes. The program he'd helped build wasn't standard academy fare. It was called the First Step Initiative, a training that focused less on tactical maneuvers and more on cultural humility, constitutional rights, and emotional intelligence. It was part law, part history, part lived experience. Julian taught it with a realism most books couldn't offer. He stepped inside, greeted by the warm clatter of folding chairs and low chatter. At the front of the room was a whiteboard across it, written in big blue marker. What does safety feel like? He turned to face the class. You've been taught how to handle threats. He began, his voice steady. But have you been taught how to recognize fear, not in yourselves, but in others? Because out there on the streets, your badge will say authority, but your uniform might also say danger. And if you don't understand that you will make mistakes that cost people more than just a citation. He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. Trust isn't earned with a flashlight and a radio. It's earned with presence, with accountability, with the willingness to see people as human before you see them as problems. Afterward, one of the trainees approached him. Jaden, a soft-spoken young man with a thoughtful gaze. Detective Carter, he said, do you really think the department can change? Like really change? Or are we just painting over cracks? Julian looked him in the eye. I don't think change is ever a single moment. It's 1,000 choices made when no one's watching. It's who you decide to be when you're the one with the power. What I know is that the system won't heal if we don't stay in it and keep pushing. Later that evening, Julian returned home to a small, weathered house in Treme. The porch light buzzed gently overhead. Naomi met him at the door, her smile tired but proud. Inside, the living room was cluttered with books and folders. His next speaking engagement at Tulane, a draft op-ed for a local paper, plans for a podcast series on policing and race in America. "You're home late," she said, handing him a mug of tea. "Good late," he replied, sinking into the couch. "We had our first real debate in class today. They're starting to ask the hard questions." She sat beside him, legs curled beneath her. "It's a start." He looked at her, then passed her to the wall above the mantel. A new photo had been hung there. Julian standing beside a group of community leaders, activists and officers. No plaques, no awards, just people who had refused to stay quiet. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Naomi asked softly. "That you'd never been stopped that night?" Julian considered this. He thought about the pain, the fear, the humiliation, but then he remembered the ripple, how one act of bias had cracked something wide open, how it had brought strangers together, forced institutions to answer for their silence. "I wish it hadn't had to happen," he said. "But I'm grateful I got to stand up when it did, because now we have a chance to make sure it doesn't happen again. Or at least, not as easily. Not without a fight." Outside, the wind carried the sound of a distant trumpet. Somewhere a second line was starting. Somewhere else, someone was pulling over, stepping out of a car, hands raised, hoping this time it would be different. Julian closed his eyes for a moment and promised silently to keep showing up, one step at a time, one truth at a time. Because justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a beat that had to be kept again and again. Julian Carter's story is not just about one night on the streets of New Orleans. It's about the heavy cost of identity in a system built to question it. A decorated black detective, mistaken for a criminal, brutalized, humiliated, and nearly silenced. Not because of anything he did, but because of who he was and how he looked. That night, with a gun pressed to his head and his badge ignored, Julian became more than a man caught in a moment. He became a mirror for a country still grappling with who it protects and who it presumes guilty. But what followed was extraordinary. Julian didn't let his trauma bury him. He didn't walk away. He chose to fight, not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of every person who had ever been dismissed, profiled, or feared by the very people sworn to protect them. He gathered evidence. He spoke out. He refused to be silenced. And when the system tried to tighten its grip, Julian pushed harder. He exposed not just the officer who assaulted him, but the culture that had protected that officer for years. His journey wasn't one of vengeance. It was one of transformation, from victim to leader, from silence to advocacy. He understood that the real battle was not just in the courtroom, but in the quiet everyday decisions made behind desks, in squad cars, and in training rooms. And so he helped build something lasting, a reform program designed to retrain, not just how officers act, but how they see Julian's story. Reminds us that change is rarely loud at first. It starts in the moments we choose not to look away, in the choices we make when no one's watching, in the refusal to let injustice become normal. He reminded us that you don't need a title or a platform to make a difference. You just need to keep showing up even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard So what's the lesson we take from all of this? It's that justice is not self-sustaining. It must be nurtured, protected, demanded. It's a practice, not a destination. And it begins with empathy. Julian's badge didn't protect him from bias, but his voice helped protect others. His courage created a ripple effect that led to real reform, real accountability, and a real shift in how a city viewed its own institutions. If you've ever wondered what you can do, if you've ever felt powerless watching the news or numb from the repetition of the same old story, Julian's journey offers a map. Speak out, stay engaged, educate yourself, support grassroots efforts, listen to those who've lived it. And when someone's voice is being ignored, amplify it, because this story doesn't end with Julian. It continues with you. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, if it sparked a conversation, if it made you feel something, then help us keep it going. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Your support fuels stories, like Julian Carter's, stories that challenge the silence, stories that demand better. So don't scroll past this moment. Be part of the change. Hit subscribe, stay loud, stay watching, and above all, stay human.